What if I told you that the most devastating weapon in history was not a sword, or a bomb, or a fire, but a sound? A sound so pure, so unified, that it turned the foundations of an unbreachable fortress into liquid dust. This is the story of a city that was not defeated by an army, but by a shout. A city that was impenetrable to man, but completely vulnerable to a promise. We work hard to bring these powerful, mind-bending stories to life. If you want to feel the power of this story, please show your support by liking this video and subscribe to our channel, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The grinding of stone against stone was the first sound. It was a low, heavy groan that shuddered through the marketplace, silencing the bartering of merchants and the calls of children. A baker's hands, white with flour, paused in their kneading. A woman's fingers, steadying a clay jar on her shoulder, tightened. Then came the shouting from the watchtowers. Near the western entrance, a man struggled with the wheel of his wooden cart. It was caught fast in a deep rut, laden with sacks of grain. His hands pushed, his sandals straining in the dust for purchase. "Move," a guard bellowed from the rampart above, his voice tight with urgency. "Clear the way, seal the gate." The great outer gates of Jericho, twin shields of bronze and timber, began to move. They moved with the agonizing slowness of immense weight, scraping a groove into the stone threshold. The merchant gave one final, desperate shove. The wheel broke free, and he scrambled his cart forward just as the two massive doors met with a sound like rolling thunder. It was not enough. The inner gates, separated by a long, fortified passage, also began to close. Finally, a colossal bar of wood, thick as a man's chest, was lowered into heavy bronze brackets. A heavy, final thud echoed through the city. It was done. Jericho was sealed. No one went out. No one came in. The air inside the fortress changed. The usual noise of the city, the laughter and the industry, evaporated. It was replaced by the shuffle of feet moving quickly, the sharp clang of a blacksmith's hammer stopping mid-swing, and the metallic sound of a watchman's spear setting against the stone parapet. The sun still beat down on the wide, high walls, but the shadows in the alleys seemed cooler, deeper. Fear was a taste in the air, like dust. By the wells women gathered, but their talk was not of their households. Their voices were low, hushed. "It is true then," one whispered, her hand stopping its work on the rope. "They crossed the Jordan." "On dry ground," another added, her eyes wide. "The river, it just stopped for them." The priest stepped into the flood, and the water vanished. A third woman, older, looked up at the wall, at the sliver of sky visible above it. "It is their God," she said, her voice barely audible. "The same one who conquered the mighty kings on the east. The one who provided food from the sky. What army can stand against such a thing?" The city of Jericho, the greatest fortress in all of Canaan, had never been breached. Its walls were a marvel, so thick that houses were built upon them. But as the sun set, casting a deep red light over the silent battlements, the people of Jericho understood. Their gates were locked, not because of Israel's weapons, but because of the God they served. The walls of Jericho were stone, high and impenetrable. But the fear inside was a living thing, climbing higher than any watchtower. Outside the silent fortress, in the camp of Israel, Joshua, son of Nun, stood alone as the evening light faded. His fingers traced the worn, smooth grain of a simple wooden staff. It was the staff of his predecessor, the staff that had seen wonders that had become legends. His sandals stood on the banks of the Jordan River. The ground was still damp, dark with the river's recent memory. He watched the water, now flowing again, churning its muddy path toward the sea. The miracle was over. The test was just beginning. His mind went back. not 40 years into the wilderness, just before. He remembered the sight of the priest's feet. He remembered the heavy, sacred ark of the covenant resting on their shoulders. He remembered their sandals, white with the dust of the march, approaching the roiling, angry edge of the river at its flood stage. The moment their toes touched the brown, swirling water, the chaos stopped. The sound of the torrent ceased. Upstream, the waters piled upon themselves, a liquid wall held back by an unseen hand, gleaming in the sunday. Downstream, the riverbed emptied, becoming a wide, dry path of cracked earth and tumbled stones. He remembered the silence of the nation, thousands upon thousands, a new generation, walking on the floor of the Jordan. The only sound was the shuffle of feet on dry ground. They had crossed, just as their fathers had crossed the Red Sea. They had stepped onto the soil of Canaan. Now the river flowed. The miracle was behind them. Ahead of them, looming against the purple sky, was the shadow of Jericho. It stood as an intimidating obstacle, the first great test of the promise. Joshua looked down at the staff in his hand. He, Joshua, now led the people, a new leader for a new chapter. Behind him stood a nation shaped by manna, miracles, and mercy. Ahead of him loomed a city that laughed at armies. But he was not Moses. Moses had spoken to the fire on the mountain. Moses had stretched this same staff over the sea. Joshua had only the weight of that staff in his hand, the memory of the river, and the impossible silhouette of the fortress. He did not know the strategy. He did not know the plan. He gripped the wood tightly. The nation waited in their tents. He waited by the river. He only knew that this battle, like the miracle of the Jordan, belonged to the Lord. From the camp at Shittim, Joshua, son of Nun, looked out at the dust. It rose in lazy plumes from the daily movements of the camp. But beyond it, on the horizon, the air was unnervingly still. The river was at their backs, a conquered memory, a line drawn in the mud by the hand of God. But the city of Jericho was ahead, a living, breathing dread. He knew the strength of his people, the warriors of the new generation. But he also knew the height of those walls, tales of which had turned the hearts of their fathers to water. He needed to see inside. He needed to know the true heart of his enemy. He summoned 2 men to his tent. The tent was simple, the air inside still and hot. He did not choose commanders. He did not choose the loud or the proud. He chose them for their steady feet and their quiet spirits, for their ability to become shadows. We see their hands, calloused and capable, as they clasped their arms in acceptance of the command. They knew what this was. Their task was simple to state, to go to see the land and especially to see Jericho. But it was a perilous performance, a mission from which most leaders would not expect a return. Joshua's face was stone, but his eyes held the weight of the order. He was sending these men into the mouth of the fortress. They did not prepare as warriors. There was no sound of armor being buckled, no sharpening of bronze blades. Their preparation was one of subtraction. We see their hands checking the leather straps of their sandals, pulling them tight for a journey that required both speed and silence. They took only what was necessary: a small, pliable skin of water, a pouch of dried grain and olives, and a single, sharp knife bound in leather, meant for the utility of cutting rope or food, not for battle. This was a mission of the eyes and the ears, not of the sword. As twilight settled over the camp, a deep, bruised purple in the sky, they slipped away. Their movement was like the passing of a breeze. They moved not as an army, but as ghosts. Their journey was a study in profound silence. The visuals follow their feet, moving with a practiced, deliberate care over loose gravel that threatened to betray them with a single, careless slip. Their hands, rough from work, gently brushed aside the tall, dry reeds that lined the wadis, the dry riverbeds that scarred the valley, their rustling sounding as loud as thunder in the quiet. The night was hot, the air thick with the buzzing of insects and the distant, lonely cry of a jackal. Above them, the stars were sharp, cold, and indifferent in a black sky. And then, after hours of walking, they saw it. It did not appear gradually. It rose from the flat earth like a mountain built by angry, human hands. The walls of Jericho were a dark shadow against the stars, a massive, silent, and arrogant challenge. The scale of it was oppressive. It blotted out the horizon. It did not look like a city. It looked like an ending. They crept forward, their backs bent, their breathing shallow, moving from one pool of darkness cast by an ancient olive tree to the next. The stone at the base of the wall was cold to the touch, and it seemed to thrum with the fear of the thousands huddled inside. They could hear the faint sounds from within, a distant shout from a watchman on the impossibly high rampart, the muffled cry of a child, the bleating of a goat. The city was alive, it was sealed tight, and they were on the outside of an impenetrable fortress with a river at their back and an entire army waiting for their word. They moved toward the great gate, seeking the smallest shadow, the slightest gap in the city's vigilance, their hearts pounding a heavy, suffocating rhythm against their ribs. The spies found their way inside the city, though it was less a plan and more a desperate, silent prayer answered by opportunity. They slipped through a supply gate, a smaller opening for merchants, in the fading moments of dusk, blending into the shadows of workers returning to their homes. The streets of Jericho were not as they expected. They were narrow, yes, and cramped, but they were not filled with life. They were filled with a nervous, electric energy. The people hurried, their eyes cast downward, their conversations low, hushed whispers of the army that had stopped the Jordan. Guards were everywhere, their spears a constant metallic presence on every corner. Doors were being barred early. The two men moved through the alleys, which were already dark as night. They were hunted, their foreign appearance a beacon. A shout went up from a side street, a guard pointing, and they ran. They were lost in a maze of stone and fear. They were cornered, their backs against a wall, their knives in their hands for a final, hopeless stand. And then a door, small and unassuming, opened beside them. A hand, stained with dye, motioned them in. It was a choice between certain capture and a complete unknown. They chose the unknown. The house was unlike any other. It was not a grand structure. It was built into the very wall of the city. The massive outer wall of Jericho, stones thick as a man is tall, served as the back wall of this small, simple home. The air inside was thick with the scent of dried herbs and the earthy smell of the loom. The owner of the house was a woman named Rahab. We do not see her face, only the outline of her form in the dim light of a single oil lamp. We see her hands. They are stained, the fingers a deep red, not from violence, but from the madder root she used for her weaving. Her fingers are nimble, pushing a wooden shuttle through the taut strings of a simple upright loom. The cloth she weaves is a deep, rich crimson. She was a woman known in Jericho, but she was not considered respectable by the city's leaders. She lived on the margins of society, in the shadows of the city, which kept her separate and in this moment overlooked by the king's patrols. Her home was small, but its position was unique. It held her life in a perfect tense balance. A small curtained window looked inward, down onto the fearful, bustling streets of the city, the sound of the guards and the whispers of panic. But another window, at the back of her home, was just a gap in the fortress. From this window, one could see over the plains, out into the darkness, where the camp of Israel lay. One window looked at the city that was. The other looked at the army that was to come. This window was her view of the world. It was a view that looked toward the future. The spies, weary, hunted, and breathing hard, stood in her small room. Her hands, stained red, slowly, deliberately stopped their weaving. For weeks, Rahab had sat at her loom, but her mind was not on the threads. The rhythmic thwack of the shuttle was the only steady thing in a city that was vibrating with fear. Her hands worked from memory, but her thoughts were outside the walls. She had heard the stories. This chapter shifts in time to the days and weeks just before the spies arrived and shows us the world from her perspective. We see her hands pausing, her gaze fixed on that outer window, the one that looked upon the plains. The narration describes the whispers she has heard, the fragments of news that chilled the city. She lived on the margins, and the margins hear everything. She heard the talk of the guards, the boasts of the merchants, the panicked whispers of the other women at the well. She had heard of the God of Israel. She heard how the great sea of reeds, the Red Sea, had parted into two great towering walls of water, allowing them to pass on dry ground before swallowing an entire army. She heard of the 40 years in the wilderness, of a people fed with a strange, sweet food that fell from the sky. And, more recently, she had heard of the mighty kings on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og. These were kings whose names were spoken in Jericho with respect and fear. Their armies were like iron, and this wandering people, this nation of former slaves led by their unseen God, had shattered them. Their cities were given to Israel. In the rest of Jericho, these stories built a wall of pure terror. The people looked at their own massive, physical defenses, the thickest walls in the world, and for the first time they felt a new, cold doubt. But in Rahab the fear was different. It was not the fear of an approaching army. It was the fear of something greater, something true. A profound, secret, and earth-shattering awe had taken root in her heart. She was a woman who knew the gods of Jericho. She had seen their stone and wooden idols carried on the shoulders of priests. They were silent. They were powerless. They offered nothing. This new God, the God of Israel, did not live in a temple of stone. He lived in the sky, in the sea, and in the hearts of his people. He acted. He spoke through parted rivers and conquered kings. Her belief was not a casual choice. It was a terrifying, logical conclusion. Their God was the God, the one who ruled the heavens above and the earth below. This was her secret. It was a dangerous, fragile spark of faith, hidden inside a city of stone that was already, in its heart, condemned. She felt the city's panic, but she alone had begun to hope. She was the only one who saw not an invader, but a terrible, holy, and cleansing fire. She was the only one in the city who understood that the walls of Jericho, for all their strength, were already dust. She had looked out that window, not just at the plains, but at the horizon, and she had been waiting. Back to the present moment. The two spies are inside Rahab's small home. The door is barred. The sound of their breathing is loud in the small space. They are speaking in low, urgent tones, and she is listening. Suddenly, their conversation is cut short. A heavy, rhythmic pounding rattles the door. It is not a polite knock. It is a demand, the sound of a spear haft striking wood. We see the spies' hands. They move instantly, gripping the knives at their belts. Their bodies tense, ready for a fight they cannot win. But Rahab's hand raises, a quiet command for silence. "Wait," she whispers. Her voice, when she calls out, is steady. "Who is it?" A rough voice answers from the street. "The king's guard. We know you have visitors. Open this door." The spies look at Rahab. This is the moment. She could save herself. She could give them up. Her life, measured against theirs. Her decision is instant. Her past did not matter. Only her faith did. Her hands move with a sharp, clear purpose. She points up, toward the ceiling, to the ladder that leads to her flat roof. Quickly, she mouths, "The flax." We see their boots on the wooden rungs, scrambling up into the darkness of the roof. Rahab follows. Her roof is covered with stalks of flax, laid out in the sun to dry. She gestures for the men to lie flat, and her hands begin to work, piling the thick, woody stalks over them, hiding them completely. She descends the ladder just as the pounding comes again, louder this time. Her hand reaches for the heavy wooden bar. She takes a single deep breath. Then she lifts the bar and opens the door. We do not see the soldiers' faces. We see their bronze helmets, catching the dim light from her lamp. We see the leather straps of their armor and the polished wooden shafts of their spears. "The king has heard," the captain says, his voice accusing. "2 men of Israel, they came to your house. Where are they?" Rahab's voice does not tremble. "They were here," she says, her words careful and quick. "They left some time ago, just before the city gates were sealed for the night." She points, not up to her roof, but out toward the road leading away from the city. "If you hurry, you might be able to catch them." The soldiers look at her. They look at her simple room. They see a woman they do not respect, a woman who would have no reason to protect the enemies of Jericho. They believe her. We see their heavy sandals turn. They thunder down her steps, and their voices fade as they run toward the main gate, shouting for it to be opened for their pursuit. Rahab's hand closes the door. She leans against the wood, the strength leaving her body. Her entire frame is trembling. The first test was over. She had chosen her side. It was hot beneath the stalks. The air was thick, choked with the dry, earthy scent of the harvest. Dust motes, disturbed by their sudden movement, danced in the thin slivers of moonlight that pierced the roof. The spies lay flat, their bodies pressed against the hard clay of the rooftop. We see a hand, the knuckles tight, gripping the simple hilt of a knife. The man did not dare draw the blade. He only held it, a small comfort in the suffocating darkness. Beside him, his companion was a silent shadow, barely breathing. Below them, they heard the sounds from the main room, the heavy booted footsteps of the soldiers, the sharp, accusing voice of their captain. "We know they are here. The king's command is clear." The spies could hear the sound of things being overturned. A clay pot shattered, the sound echoing sharp and final. Their hearts pounded against their ribs. Any sound, a cough, a shifting of weight would mean the end. The stalks of flax were their only shield, a fragile, rustling defense. Then they heard Rahab's voice. It was not the voice of a woman in fear. It was steady, almost dismissive. "I told you," she said, "they were here. But they are long gone. They left before the city gates were locked for the night. You are wasting your time." There was a long, heavy silence. The men on the roof did not breathe. They could hear the creak of a soldier's leather armor. "If we find you have lied," the captain's voice was cold, "not even this wall will save you." More footsteps. The heavy, scraping sound of the door being unbarred, the sound of the soldiers' boots clattering down the narrow stone steps into the street. Then, the final thud of the door closing. The bar slid back into its bracket. For a long time, the 2 men remained perfectly still, listening to the silence of the house. Finally, they heard the soft, light sound of Rahab's feet on the ladder. The flax was gently pulled away. The cool, clean air of the night washed over them, and it felt like the first breath they had ever taken. The moon cast a pale, clear light over the rooftop. The city of Jericho was spread out below them, a maze of dark, silent streets, locked inside its own fear. Rahab stood before the 2 spies. Her hands, which had been trembling after the soldiers left, were now clasped firmly in front of her. She looked at the men, and her voice was low, but filled with a strange certainty. "I know," she began, "that the Lord, your God, has given you this land." The spies stared at her. This was not the confession of a woman trying to bargain. It was a statement of faith. We are all afraid of you, she continued, her gaze moving past them, out toward the dark plains. Everyone in this country is living in terror. For we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea. We know what you did to the kings on the other side of the Jordan. The Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below. She had named their God. She, a woman from a city of stone idols, had named the one true God. Her hands unclenched. Now, she said, her voice softening, please swear to me by the Lord. Swear, since I have been kind to you, that you will be kind to me and my family, that you will spare us when Jericho falls. The two spies looked at one another. This woman, who lived on the margins of her society, had shown them more faith than many they knew. One of the men nodded, his voice firm. Our life for your life, he said, if you do not tell what we are doing. He reached into the small leather pouch at his belt. His hand emerged, but it did not hold a coin or a weapon. It held a length of cord, dyed a deep, vibrant red. We see his hand place the scarlet cord into Rahab's. When the Lord delivers Jericho, he said, you must tie this cord in this very window, the one you used to let us down. You must gather your father, your mother, your brothers, and all of your family into this house with you. His voice became a solemn warning. Anyone who is inside this house will be safe, but if anyone goes out of the doors of your house into the street, their fate will be upon their own head. And if you betray this business of ours, we will be free from the oath you have made us swear. Rahab's fingers closed tightly around the cord. I understand, she said. It was a covenant. Rahab's hands, the same hands that worked the threads of her loom, moved with purpose. She retrieved a heavy, coiled rope from a wooden chest. It was thick and coarse, strong enough to hold a man's weight. She brought it to the window, the one that faced the darkness outside the city. She secured the rope to a heavy anchor point within her home. The first spy swung his legs over the stone sill. We see his sandals pressing flat against the outer face of the great wall, searching for a small foothold in the rough-hewn stone. His hands gripped the rope, and he began his slow, silent descent into the blackness. The second spy followed. Rahab watched from the window, holding her breath, until the faint sound of their feet touching the dry earth far below reached her. They paused for a moment, two small shadows, and then vanished into the night. She pulled the heavy rope back up, her arms straining with the effort. She coiled it and hid it. The city was silent. There was no alarm. Her hand was still closed around the scarlet cord. She went back to the window. She looked at the simple, dyed thread. It seemed so small, so fragile against the immense, powerful wall of Jericho. It was a piece of thread against a fortress of stone. With careful, deliberate fingers, she tied the scarlet cord to the wooden lattice of the window. It hung there, a tiny streak of color in the moonlight. It was a fragile flag of hope, a whisper of a promise hanging against the backdrop of an impossible, unbreachable defense. For Rahab, it was the only defense that mattered. She had made her choice, and now she could only trust. For 3 days, the spies did as Rahab had instructed. They did not flee back to the camp. They hid in the hills that rose from the valley. We see their feet moving over loose rock, their hands brushing aside thorns as they found cover in a small, dry cave. From their hiding place, they watched. They saw the patrols of the king's soldiers, their spears glinting in the sun, searching the roads and the river crossings in vain. The city of Jericho remained sealed, a fortress of fear. On the 3rd day, when the pursuit had quieted, the two men made their way back to the camp of Israel. They were brought before Joshua. They were covered in dust, their clothes were torn, and they were weary from their journey, but their eyes were alive. Inside Joshua's tent, the air was still. Joshua, son of Nun, stood over a simple wooden table, his hand resting on the smooth wood of the staff that had once belonged to Moses. He looked at the two men, and his face was calm, waiting. The first spy stepped forward. He did not speak of the height of the walls. He did not describe the strength of the gates or the number of the soldiers. He spoke of the fear. He told Joshua of the conversation in the streets, of the paralysis that had gripped the city. He told him of the woman named Rahab, of her faith, and of the promise they had made. And then he delivered the final, true report. The narrator's voice swells with his words. The Lord has truly given all this land into your hands. All the people of the land are melting in fear because of us. The words filled the tent. They were the confirmation. They were the sign Joshua had been waiting for. We see Joshua's hand tighten its grip on the staff. The heavy weight of the mantle, the doubt of a new leader, was lifted. It was replaced by a profound and steady resolve. He knew the promise was true. The city was theirs. He dismissed the men from his tent. He now knew with certainty that God would deliver the city. He just did not yet know how. He bowed his head, ready to receive the instructions for the most unusual battle plan in history. Joshua, son of Nun, remained in his tent. The report from the two spies had settled in his heart, a stone of assurance. The city was afraid. The Lord had, as promised, given it into their hands. But the great physical question remained. The walls of Jericho, creations of stone and human pride, still stood, casting a long shadow over the camp of Israel as the sun began to sink. The what had been confirmed. The how was still a silence. He knelt, his hands resting not on a sword, but on the simple wooden staff that was his only inheritance of leadership. He closed his eyes. The canvas of the tent filtered the last orange light of the day. He did not ask for victory. He did not ask for strength or for a clever plan of attack. He waited for instruction. The God who had parted the Jordan, the God who had held back a flooding river, would provide the way. And in the quiet of his mind, the instruction came. It was not a strategy of war. It was not a plan for ladders or for siege engines or for a long, drawn-out blockade to starve the city. It was something else entirely. It was a plan that seemed, by human understanding, to be absurd. It was a strategy built not on military might, but on pure, unyielding obedience. The voice of the Lord was clear. You shall march around the city. Joshua's hand tightened on the staff. He was to take all the men of war, and they were to circle the city one time. They were to do this for 6 days. And the priests, the holy men, would have their part. 7 priests were to carry 7 trumpets, horns from rams, and they were to walk before the sacred Ark of the Covenant. On the 7th day, the plan changed. On the 7th day, they were not to march once. They were to march around the city 7 times. And on that 7th lap, the priests would blow a long, sustained blast on their horns. When you hear that sound, the instruction continued, all the people shall shout with a mighty shout. And the result? Then the walls of the city will collapse. Joshua opened his eyes. The tent was dark. A single oil lamp cast a flickering glow on his hands. The walls would collapse, not from battering rams, not from a single sword-striking stone. They would fall from the sound of trumpets and the unified shout of a faithful people. It was madness to a soldier's mind. It was childlike, but it was not a soldier's plan, it was God's. Joshua knew with a sudden, profound clarity that the purpose of this plan was not just to take the city. It was to show Israel and all of Canaan that the victory belonged to the Lord alone. He rose from his knees. His doubt was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce focus. He stepped out of his tent into the cool night air. He summoned the priests and the commanders of the army. We see their hands in the firelight. A commander's hand resting on the hilt of his bronze sword, a priest's hand holding a small scroll of the law. They listened as Joshua spoke. He relayed the divine strategy, every strange and specific detail. A commander's brow furrowed. He looked at the walls, then back at Joshua. His hand on his sword did not move, but his knuckles were white. To walk in silence, to carry trumpets instead of ladders. But these were men who had walked through a parted river. They had seen the impossible. There was no argument, there was no debate. There was only the quiet, puzzled, and complete acceptance of obedience. The stage was set. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, turning the sky from deep indigo to a pale, hopeful gray. Inside Jericho, the mood was tense. The guards on the high walls had spent a fitful night. They stood at their posts, their spears sharp, their eyes scanning the Israelite camp. They expected an attack. They expected the sudden, brutal rush of a siege, the sound of ladders scraping against stone, the roar of an invading army. The city was sealed, and its defenders were ready for a conventional, human war. But in the camp of Israel, a different preparation was underway. There was no sound of sharpening metal. There were no orders for a charge. Instead, there was the sound of water as the priests washed their feet, preparing themselves to carry the holiest object in their possession. The procession formed in the cool morning air. We see the feet of the 7 priests, bare and clean, as they stepped forward. In their hands, they held the simple, curved horns of rams. Behind them, other priests gently lifted the Ark of the Covenant to their shoulders. The sacred box, overlaid with gold, was the symbol of God's presence, and it would lead the way. Then came the armed men, an army of thousands, but their swords remained in their sheaths. Their spears were held, but not poised to throw. Their command for the day was not to fight, but to be silent. The great procession began to move. It advanced toward the city, not with a run, but with a steady, determined walk. The only sound that broke the morning quiet was the rhythmic shuffling of thousands of sandals in the thick dust. Then the horn sounded. It was not a call to battle. It was a deep, haunting, piercing blast. The 7 horns breathed out a single, unified note that echoed across the plains and struck the great stone walls. From the ramparts, the guards of Jericho watched. They gripped their spears. They stared. This was not an attack. It was a parade. The armed men of Israel, their faces set, their mouths closed, marched in perfect formation. They did not look up. They did not shout taunts. They simply walked. The ark followed, carried with reverence. The 7 priests walked before it, their cheeks full as they blew the horns. The procession made one full circuit of the mighty city. The guards on the wall, who had been frozen in tense anticipation, began to relax. Their fear turned to confusion, and then to mockery. "Is this their plan?" one shouted, his voice echoing. "Do they mean to bore us into surrender?" Another laughed. "It is a child's ritual. They walk and blow horns like shepherds calling sheep." Their insults and laughter rained down, but they were met with no reply. The army of Israel did not falter. They did not shout back. They completed their circle. And then, as silently as they had come, the entire procession turned and marched back to their camp. The gates of Jericho remained sealed. The walls stood, unshaken. But as the sun climbed higher, the guards' laughter died in their throats. It had been strange. The silence of the enemy, the haunting sound of the horns, the unwavering focus of the march. It was no ordinary tactic of war. It was something else. And a new cold unease began to creep into their hearts. On the second day, the sun rose again over the plains. The guards of Jericho were at their posts much earlier. Their mockery from the day before was gone, replaced by a sullen, watchful curiosity. They stared at the camp of Israel, waiting, and the procession began again. It formed in the exact same way. The 7 priests, their horns in their hands, the sacred ark lifted to the priests' shoulders, the silent army falling into formation. They marched. The same sound of thousands of feet shuffling through the dust, the same piercing, unearthly cry of the ram's horns. They circled the massive city one time. The guards watched. No one spoke. The soldiers on the wall stood like statues of stone, their hands gripping their spears. The procession finished its lap and returned to the camp. The silence that remained was heavier, more profound than before. On the 3rd day, it happened again. The ritual was repeated without any change. The feet, the horns, the ark, the silent, marching thousands. The repetition itself became the weapon. It was unnatural. Armies were built on action, on shouting, on the chaos of conflict. This army was built on a terrifying, disciplined quiet. Inside the city, the tension began to twist. The population of Jericho, locked behind their gates, could not see the procession, but they could hear it. They could hear the distant, mournful blast of the horns, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and they could feel the silence that followed. By the 4th day, the city's normal life had stopped. We see a baker's hands frozen, not putting the bread into the oven. We see a weaver's hand, still on the loom, her foot off the pedal. The merchants in the marketplace did not call out their wares. The people of Jericho were listening. They were paralyzed by a sound and by the lack of one. The psychological pressure was immense. The walls had been built to keep enemies out, but now they served to trap the people of Jericho inside with their own mounting, suffocating fear. On the 5th day, the guards on the wall no longer looked defiant. They looked exhausted. They were being worn down not by arrows or by stones, but by a relentless display of faith. They watched the Israelites march. They heard the horns. They saw the army return to its camp. On the 6th day, the sun rose. The procession began. The march was the same. The horns blew. The silence was perfect. The circuit was completed. As the sun began to set on that 6th day, a different kind of quiet settled over the valley. The procession returned to the Israelite camp for the last time before the final day. A heavy, portentous stillness fell. The air was thick with anticipation. The soldiers of Jericho stood on the walls, staring into the dusk, their knuckles white on their spears. They knew this was not a game. They knew this ritual was building toward something. Inside the house on the wall, Rahab's hands gripped the wooden frame of her window. The small scarlet cord beside her hand was a tiny speck of color against the darkening stone. She too had heard the horns. She too had felt the silence. Tomorrow was the 7th day. As the sun of the 6th day began to touch the western horizon, the great, silent army of Israel completed its circuit. The horns sounded their final, haunting note, and the sound of marching feet faded as the procession turned and walked back to its camp in the distance. A profound, unnatural stillness descended upon Jericho. This silence was worse than the noise. When the horns were blowing, there was something to focus on, an enemy to watch. But in the quiet, there was only the sound of one's own heart beating a heavy, frightened rhythm. The guards on the high walls did not cheer. They did not mock. They did not even speak to one another. We see a close view of a soldier's hand, gripping his spear shaft so tightly that his knuckles were white. His hand was trembling, not from cold, but from a deep, weary dread. He stared out at the Israelite camp, which was now settling into its own quiet evening routine, as if nothing unusual had happened. This normalcy, this disciplined patience was the most terrifying thing of all. Inside the city, the paralysis that had begun on the 3rd day was now complete. The great marketplace was empty. A merchant's stall was seen, its colorful fabrics spilling onto the stone, abandoned. A single piece of fruit, dropped in haste, lay in the dust. The bakeries were cold, their ovens unlit. The sounds of industry, the hammer on the anvil, the scraping of the potter's wheel had ceased. The city of Jericho was holding its breath. In the house on the wall, the home of Rahab, a small group of people were gathered. We see their hands, clasped together in the dim light of a single oil lamp. Her father's hand, old and wrinkled. Her mother's hand, trembling, holding the hand of a younger sibling. They were all there, just as she had been instructed. Rahab's own hand went to the window, her fingers brushing against the simple scarlet cord. It was so small. The wall was so thick. She looked at the cord and then at her family. Her past was behind her in this city of fear. Her future, and the future of her family, was tied to this single piece of thread and to the God she had chosen to trust. The moon rose, casting a pale, sickly light over the fortress. The walls, which had always represented strength, now felt like the walls of a cage. The sixth day ended. The city waited in a suffocating, silent darkness, knowing that something was coming. They were caught between the unbreachable walls of stone and the relentless, patient God on the other side. The first hint of dawn was not yet visible. The air was cool and perfectly still, heavy with the moisture of the plains. In the camp of Israel, there was movement. It was not the hurried, chaotic movement of an army preparing for a charge. It was the quiet, purposeful stirring of a nation with a single, unified task. Feet were washed. Sandals were strapped tight. Joshua, son of Nun, stood at the entrance of his tent, his gaze fixed on the dark shadow of Jericho against the slowly lightening sky. His face was calm, his focus absolute. He gave the simple command to begin. The procession formed in the pre-dawn darkness. The 7 priests, their steps measured, lifted the 7 horns. The Ark of the Covenant, the golden symbol of the promise, was lifted to the shoulders of its bearers. The army, thousands of armed men, fell into place, their faces set, their mouths closed. They began to march. As the first edge of the sun broke over the eastern hills, the horns sounded their first blast of the 7th day. On the walls of Jericho, the guards, who had not slept, saw them coming. Their hearts seized. They watched as the army and the ark completed the first circuit of the city. But this time, the procession did not stop. It did not turn back toward its camp. As the first lap ended, the second one began immediately. The sun climbed. The sound of the horns, which had been haunting, now became relentless. It was a continuous, piercing cry that seemed to worm its way into the very stones of the city. The third lap began. The sun was higher now, the heat beginning to build. We see the feet of the marchers, already coated in a fine, pale dust. They did not slow, they did not speak, they just walked. The fourth lap, the sound of the horns and the endless, rhythmic shuffling of feet was the only sound in the world. Inside the city, people covered their ears. It was a psychological assault, a marathon of faith. The fifth lap, the sun was approaching its zenith, beating down without mercy. We see the brows of the priests from the neck down, their skin wet. Their arms had to be strong to hold the horns. Their breath had to be steady. They continued to blow. The sixth lap, the tension was now a physical thing, a tight band around the city. The soldiers on the walls were no longer soldiers. They were statues, frozen in a state of terrified awe. They had watched this army circle them, hour after hour. Their own strength was useless. Their walls were meaningless. They were passive spectators to a divine appointment. Inside the house on the wall, Rahab and her family were on the floor. They did not dare look out the window. They only listened to the horns, lap after lap, a sound that was both a promise and a threat, circling them over and over. The sixth lap was complete. The sun was a hammer of heat directly overhead. There was no shade. The army of Israel, weary from hours of marching, did not pause. Their legs ached. Their throats were dry, but their discipline held. Joshua walked among them, his presence a silent source of strength. They began the seventh and final circuit. There was a change in the air. This lap felt different. The steps of the soldiers seemed heavier, more deliberate, striking the earth with a final, rhythmic purpose. The blasts from the 7 priests on their rams' horns seemed to split the air with a new, urgent, and triumphant intensity. On the walls of Jericho, the guards were broken. Their spears lay at their feet. Their hands were limp at their sides. They stared, wide-eyed, as the procession made its last, slow journey around their mighty fortress. They were men who had seen the foundation of their world, their belief in stone and strength, dismantled by nothing more than walking, silence, and sound. Inside the small house, Rahab's hand gripped the wooden window frame. The scarlet cord, which had hung limp, now fluttered slightly in a hot, sudden breeze. She could feel the end approaching. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent, desperate prayer. Her entire life had led to this moment, to this test of a faith she had only just found. The army of Israel completed the 7th lap. The procession came to a halt. Thousands of men, as one, stopped moving. Their feet, which had shuffled for hours, became still. And then, the most terrifying sound of all, silence. The horns, which had been blowing relentlessly, stopped. The sudden, absolute quiet that fell over the plain was shocking. It was heavier than stone, more profound than any noise. The world seemed to stop. The air was thick, unmoving. A single small stone, dislodged by a bird on the high rampart, was seen rattling down the face of the wall. In the immense silence, it sounded like a crack of thunder. Every eye in Israel, every eye in Jericho was fixed. The stage was set. We see Joshua's arm. It rises slowly, high above his head, his hand open against the bright, unforgiving sky. He holds it there for one long, final beat. The hand of Joshua, which had been raised against the bright, hot sky, did not waver. It was a clear, unmoving signal, visible to the entire nation of Israel, which stood silent, their feet planted in the dust of the 7th lap. The air was so still it felt as if the world had stopped breathing. The priests, their horns now silent, stood with the sacred ark. The soldiers on the walls of Jericho were pale, frozen figures, watching, waiting for the end of this strange, unearthly ritual. In the house on the wall, Rahab's hand was pressed over her own mouth, her family huddled behind her. They listened to the great, heavy silence. Then Joshua's voice rose, a single, sharp command that cut through the stillness. His voice was not heard by all, but the signal was seen, and the commanders echoed it. The hand, held high, chopped down through the air. "Shout," the narration thundered, "for the Lord has given you the city." It began not as a shout, but as a low, deep rumble. It started in the chests of thousands of men, a sound from the earth itself. It was the sound of 40 years of wandering, the sound of a promise about to be fulfilled, the sound of a faith that had, against all reason, obeyed. In a single moment, that rumble erupted. From thousands of Israelite voices came a single, unified, colossal roar. It was not a scream of rage. It was a holy battle cry, a sound of pure, concentrated faith. It was a noise unlike anything the ancient world had ever heard. The sound wave, a physical, invisible force, rolled across the plain. It struck the great towering walls of Jericho. The air itself seemed to tremble. The very ground beneath their feet vibrated, as if a great bell had been struck. The birds that had been circling in the sky scattered, fleeing the deafening sound. The shout continued, sustained by thousands of lungs, a note of pure power that held the city in its grip. The soldiers on the wall were seen to clap their hands over their ears, their faces contorted, but there was no escape from the sound. It was everywhere, and it was just the beginning. The great, unified shout of Israel was still echoing when a new sound began. It was a sound that came from deep within the earth. A low, terrible groan, a deep, shuddering rumble. We see a close view of the base of the mighty wall. A single, small stone, vibrated loose by the shout, fell from its place. Then another. Then a thin, spiderweb crack appeared in a massive foundation block. The ground beneath Jericho shifted. The mighty walls, those thick, towering defenses built to keep enemies out for generations, began to fail. They did not explode. They did not fall outward. They buckled inward, as though pressed by the invisible weight of the heavens. We see a section of the wall, houses thick, begin to groan as the stones ground against each other. Foundations collapsed. Watchtowers, once so proud, crumbled, their stones bursting like splinters. A great plume of dust, pale and thick, exploded upwards, blotting out the Sunday. In a matter of seconds, the city's unbreakable defense became nothing more than a pile of rubble and a cloud of choking dust. The shout of the Israelites changed. It was no longer a shout of faith, but a cry of victory. We see their feet, the feet of the warriors of Israel, their sandals kicking up the dust as they rushed forward. They ran not at a solid wall, but at the great open breaches that had been made. The city, now exposed, was entered quickly. The air was thick with the gray, swirling dust. The narration describes the chaos, the sounds of the city falling, the confusion as the dust cloud covered everything. The city that had been sealed tight by its own fear was now open, its fate sealed by obedience to a divine plan. Through the thick, choking cloud of dust and the sound of the city's fall, two figures were running. They were not running with the other warriors. They were not moving toward the center of the city. They ran with a different, urgent purpose. It was them, the same two spies who had once hidden beneath the flax on a rooftop. They navigated the rubble, their eyes fixed on one spot. Through the haze they saw it, an impossible sight. One single, small section of the outer wall had not collapsed. It stood, intact, like a lone tooth in a broken jaw. And from its window, fluttering in the hot, dusty wind, was a single, simple, scarlet cord. They scrambled over the piles of broken stone and timber that had fallen around the base of the house. They reached the door. Inside, Rahab and her family were huddled in the darkness, trembling, listening to the terrifying sounds of their world ending. They heard the pounding on the door. But these were not the hands of soldiers. The spies burst in. We see their hands, covered in dust, reach for her. Rahab, they called, their voices urgent. Come quickly, all of you. Just as they had sworn, they took her by the hand. They led her family out. We see a close-up of their hands, one after another, her father's hand, her mother's, her siblings. They were led out of the house, away from the wall, and through the breach in the defenses. The spies led them through the chaotic ruins, protecting them. They brought Rahab and all her family to a place of safety, outside the camp of Israel. She stood there, her feet on the solid ground, her family around her, breathing in the air of a new life. She looked back at the smoke and dust. She had obeyed. She had believed. And the promise made to her had been kept. As the smoke began to rise over the ruins of what had once been the mightiest fortress in Canaan, Joshua, son of Nun, stood before the people. We see his hand, pointing toward the smoldering rubble. The narrator describes the curse he pronounced upon that place. Cursed is the man who tries to rebuild this city. He will pay a heavy price to lay its foundation, and a great cost to set up its gates. The victory was complete. It was a spiritual triumph that signaled to all the land that the God of Israel was with his people. But the story did not end with the fall of a city. It continued with the life of a single woman. Rahab and her family were not just spared, they were welcomed. They were adopted, brought into the people of God. Her past no longer defined her. Her faith did. She would go on to marry a man from the tribe of Judah, a man named Salmon. We see her hand, years later, no longer stained with dye, but joined with his. And together they would have a son named Boaz. The narrator's voice builds as the scarlet thread is followed through history. This same Boaz, the son of the woman from Jericho, would one day marry a woman from Moab, a woman named Ruth. From them came Obed, and from Obed came Jesse. And Jesse was the father of a young shepherd who would become the great King David. And generations later, down this same unbroken family line, would come another, Jesus, the Messiah. Think about it. Rahab, a woman from a condemned city, a woman living on the margins of society, became a direct ancestor of the King of Kings. Why? Because she believed, because she acted on that belief, because she hid the spies, hung the scarlet cord, and entrusted her entire life to the God of Israel. The story of Jericho is more than history. It is a mirror, reflecting the power of a God who makes a way where there is no way. It is a testament that no wall is too high, and no past is too dark to be redeemed. When faith meets obedience, those walls begin to fall. Trust him beyond your understanding, and watch what he will do. When I reflect on this story, what strikes me the most is that it is not really about the fall of a stone wall. It is a story about the crumbling of two different kinds of barriers, the barrier of impossibility and the barrier of unworthiness. On one side you have Joshua and the people of Israel. They are facing this massive, unbeatable fortress. Their challenge is external. They are asked to follow a plan that makes no logical sense. They have to walk in silence when every instinct must be telling them to fight. Their journey teaches us about obedience, even when we cannot see the final step, and about trusting that some victories are not won by our own strength. But then there is Rahab. Her story is, for me, even more profound. She is not an outsider by choice. She is someone society has placed on the very margins. Her walls are internal. They are the walls of her past, her reputation, and her identity within a city that is doomed. Yet, in the middle of all that fear, she is the only one who truly sees the truth. She hears the rumors of what God has done, and she chooses to believe. She acts on that tiny spark of faith, risking everything to protect the two spies. Rahab's lesson is one of incredible hope. It tells me that no one is beyond reach. It does not matter what walls you have built around your own heart, or what walls society has built around you. Your past does not have the final say. A single moment of genuine faith can change your entire destiny. She was not just saved from something, she was saved for something. She became a part of a legacy that stretched for generations, a direct ancestor of King David and, generations later, Jesus. Joshua's lesson is about how we face our own Jerichos. We all have them. They are the problems that seem too big, the fears that paralyze us, the obstacles that look completely unbreakable. We try to attack them with our own strength, with our own logic, and we fail. This story suggests a different way, a way of patience, of obedience, and of trusting a process that might look foolish to the rest of the world. So, I would ask you to think about this. What are the walls in your own life today? Are they external, like a challenge that seems too big to overcome? Or are they internal, like the voice that tells you that you are not worthy, that your past defines you? This story offers us a new perspective. It tells us to have the faith of Rahab, to believe in a new future even when we are surrounded by the old. And it tells us to have the obedience of Joshua, to keep marching even when the path makes no sense. Because sometimes the greatest victories are not won with our own might, but with a simple, powerful, and persistent faith that can make any wall, no matter how high, come crumbling down. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like. It helps the light reach others who may need it. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. I would love to hear what part spoke to you most. And if you wish to continue this journey of quiet stories, faith, and healing, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter. May the light stay with you, always.